Hello everyone, welcome back. And we're very lucky to have Mark Diggins here with us again to go a little bit deeper into the understanding of the complexities involved when you're making decisions about going touring in the backcountry. So I'll just hand over to Mark. He can give a bit of a summary of what he's going to talk about, and then we're going to go to some questions that we've had since last week's talk.
Great. Thanks very much, Ian and Leslie. What we'll probably start off with is some questions that have come from you guys, and we've just picked out some key ones, which are very good questions.
So, in watching the weather conditions over the season, can you highlight the key weather conditions that, one, ring alarm bells as potentially developing or supporting the development of weak layers in the snowpack, and two, that will help the snowpack to become more stable?
Great, thanks, Leslie. Well, these are really key questions. And so what we actually look at when we're producing forecasts, to a large extent, we do look at patterns. And that's patterns that of weather that create a certain sort of snow condition that will start to make us become more aware of what potentially might happen. And so one of the patterns as developing a weak layer is this one here. And it's actually what's happening right now. So it's very, very relevant both to today and also for when we're looking at the tour with Leslie. So the first thing is our history of the snowpack. And probably about 4 or 5 days ago, we've got a good snow cover, but it's had some instabilities high up, but they've gradually become more and more diminished because of, become quite firm and hard. Then a few days ago, we had a snowfall without any wind whatsoever. So we had a complete carpet and blanket of snow, which is about probably a few centimeters deep, maybe 3-4 centimeters deep. And today, and maybe last night with Storm Christoph, we've had a considerable increase in the snow amount with wind. And what's happened is there's been a lot of snowfall. I'm at Glenmore Lodge here, which is about 400 meters altitude, and we probably had about here 30 to 40 centimeters of snow just outside. So it's a lot of snow, and that's been driven by the wind, and so that is a wind slab over this really, really soft layer. And that then, what then happens is if it remains cold, which it is, and it's going to be, then this soft, weak layer that underlies the slab is like really, really loose. You can almost put your fist in it. That won't change. That won't bond. That won't stabilize because of these really cold temperatures. And so for us, that's something that we'll be monitoring over the next days. Lower down, it will probably diminish, with fluctuating temperatures, but above a certain altitude, it will be quite a different story. So here you can see, this is an extract from our forecast of a few days ago, thin covering of snow in all aspects, isolated instabilities persisting, and it tells you where they are confined. And this is just a good example, actually, of how important it is to look at the text and look at the detail of avalanche reports, because they tell you where the problem is. And we often talk about avalanche hazard and the avalanche hazard scale, but the avalanche problem that we've identified is what leads us to the right avalanche hazard scale. So the avalanche problem is a really important factor to look at. So, so this then is the next forecast. Unless we had just yesterday, persistent snowfall is expected above 400 meters. So that we have that on top of this soft layer. And then we have cold temperatures remaining. And so this actually was today. And you can see the summit temperature there at Cairngorm -5 and 6 throughout the day. And we have very strong winds, northwesterly, northwesterly. And so when the optimum speed for the production of slab, if you like, a wind slab is 40 miles an hour. So this is really pushing a hell of a lot of slab into easterly, southeasterly aspects. So that's the first question. And then the next one is what will make it more stable? In a way, this is slightly similar, simpler to answer. It's relatively logical, and it's to do with really looking at the weather, of course, and the temperatures. And if it's freezing levels around the summits and above, then of course it's going to be warm, and it's going to gradually improve the snowpack. What tends to happen is if we have a sharp rise in temperature and rainfall, heavy rainfall at summits, then what tends to happen, it tends to purge a slope. And then, which is a sort of a natural cycle which gets rid of all the avalanche activity, and then it stabilizes quite well after that. So logically, if it gets warmer, then it refreezes and the temperatures are at low levels, then logically it's going to present us with a much more stable snowpack, which indeed that was the situation a few days ago. So, so this is again our observed weather influences, and again this is something that you can look at because that gives you clues as to what's happening on with the weather and its impact on the snowpack.
So the next question relates to somebody who does all their touring outside of the SAIS areas, so mainly on Ben Lawers and Torridon. What advice do you have to help people in non-SAIS areas assess risk?
Okay, well, interesting to use the word risk because actually we deal a lot with hazard and risk. Hazard and risk are quite different things. So risk is when we are actually interacting with hazard. So you can have a hazard, but if you don't interact with it, there's no risk. So that's something just to clarify. But we do now, a few years ago, we did start to operate in Torridon. We've had a forecast service there, and Torridon, it's not just Torridon itself. It goes from in the Fanics way over to Anchelic and all that area. So it's a huge area that we now cover with the Torridon forecast. So, but of course, there are other areas, and right now there is, quite a bit of snow in places like the Pentlands. There's avalanche activity there today, in fact, and other areas. So I think often you can refer to nearby avalanche forecast areas, and actually often there's quite a consistency between all the areas, especially in terms of where the wind's blowing from and which slopes are being affected. The thing that will differ from area to area are the snow amounts, but really one can, if you like, extrapolate from one forecast area into another area generally. But if you don't have if you're quite a way away from a forecast area, then the thing you can really do is you obviously monitor the wind direction and speed to identify which slopes the snow is accumulating on. And as I said earlier, 50 mile an hour is the optimum speed for wind slab to build up, but drifting can occur at really low speeds, 5, 6, 12 kilometers an hour in cold conditions, especially when the snow is cold. So, and then the freezing level, of course, that will tell you at what level the snow is falling to, and also, of course, if there's precipitation. So there are just some key things, but I would say the main thing is to look at wind direction and speed, because in our environment, these are the key factors to watch out for.
Thanks, Mark.
Thank you.
We have a question from somebody who's obviously done a season or two in Canada. And when they were there, they were told to leave new storm snowfall for 24 hours before venturing out. Is that something that you would say is true to the UK?
In fact, yeah, I think there's not many rules in an avalanche world because, you know, you often get caught out if you make assumptions. But generally speaking, this 24-hour rule is a good one. You know, if there is snow and it's generally sort of median snowfall, and there is sort of generally warmish sort of temperatures, then it will consolidate and improve. And 24 hours is a good rule of thumb. Interestingly, though, in Canada, they have one of the avalanche problems, or one of the factors they have, is storm snow. And actually, storm snow in Canada doesn't fall with wind. It's mostly a storm without much wind, and so you get a great depth of fairly fresh powder, which is something that's very alien in our environment, because mostly all storms have wind. So that's the difference. But yes, generally speaking, a 24-hour rule is a good rule, good principle. The caveat is, if it's cold, then weaknesses will persist. All right, and I'll talk about that a bit later.
You said if it's warmish temperatures, the snow will consolidate. What would you describe to be warmish temperatures?
I would say if you're looking at the summits, say 1,200 meter summits, then you're going to get -1, -2, 0 at the summit level. So around that those sorts of temperatures, with the freezing level maybe around about 900 to 1,000 meters, fluctuating around there.
Okay.
Is that right?
Yeah.
Okay.
Question 4 is moving on to a question about snow pits and snow profiles. So we have a question from somebody who would like to know the correlation between the layer failures, or the failures in the layers, and the hardness and the relationship with the steepness of the slope.
Okay, so I suppose on this one, this starts to get like really super technical, and to a certain extent, my answer would be, don't overcomplicate things by thinking that detailed scientific observation are going to provide all the answers. And I'll explain a little bit about that in a moment. But certainly, you know, one can think, okay, there's a weak layer, what angle, what steepness will that start to release? Am I okay? Et cetera, et cetera. When you start making fine judgments like that, then it's a bit of a, I don't believe you can make those sorts of decisions because there is such uncertainty, especially in our environment, because of the wind and there's variability over an area, and therefore what we have to think, if there's a weakness, if there's something that we're uncertain about, then you have to take action based on uncertainty, and that's a key word, I would say. But if you then look at this, obviously is us for the avalanche service doing a snow profile, and we're looking at temperatures because we want to see how the evolution of the snowpack and what's it doing over time. But actually, most of the information that we use for avalanche hazard evaluation is gathered through traveling and field observations. And in fact, we could probably produce avalanche reports very easily without actually making all these measurements and doing all these, writing down all the crystal sizes and so on. And really, that's a very, very important thing. And I'll just go on a little bit more about that just now. And again, this is a slide I used last week. It's a series of tests, if you like, Reusch-Block tests, which is a sort of test that you excavate a square, which is of a big dining room table size, and it's isolated block, if you like. Then you sort of progressively stand on it with your skis and weight it and jump it and so on progressively, and you'll find something that takes a lot of effort to fail, eventually fails, is quite strong, and that's a 7. Something that fails quite easily with maybe just stepping on it gently, that's a 1 or a 0 or a 1. And so you can see in this array here of all these 57 tests, you've got 7, which is strong, next to 2, which is weak. So it's really, it's a bit of a dodgy thing, actually, if you use a snow profile, a snow pit, to make decisions about a slope, because you're going to get false information. What it can give you is, when you do look at a snow profile, it can give you some understanding of what's going on in terms of how one layer of snow interacts with another layer of snow, but that's all. And these simple field observations are important and highly significant for hazard evaluation. And I'll just run through. There's a few little movies there. One on the right. So we use a lot of simple, I mean, you think that, oh, that's like really simple, but actually it gives us a fantastic amount of information. If you squeeze the snow with one hand and you make a snowball, that's a positive thing. If you put your hand in the snow and you squeeze it and it remains like dust, then that is a negative thing, in that you probably have weak grains will persist, weaknesses will persist, and there's not much bonding going on. Again, moving around. You can see a layer failure, and this actually was today. So this was on an southeast aspect at 500 meters. And this is a consequence of this pattern, if you like, that we talked about earlier, where we had hard snow a few days ago, soft snow layer, and now we got wind slab on top. It really is a bit of a critical situation at the moment. And then finally, you know, observations on the ground, giving you good clues. That's a good slope to ski, actually. It'd be really nice snow, but it indicates that in other places where it's steeper, that there is a significant difference. And then finally, the picture on the left, you know, you've got a slab avalanche. So all these things, these observations, although they might be simple, they give you fantastic information. Because for us, when we are traveling, especially in our environment, which is very dynamic and changing, there is no one piece of information that you can collect which will give you the answer. So what you have to do is you have your radar going all the time, and you're just picking out clues and many, many small things which cumulatively give you a really good answers to your questions and give you a really good feeling about what's going on in the snow.
So we've got a few questions in the chat. If there's a weak layer in the snowpack, can it become more stable if temperatures remain well below 0?
Yes, it can. And that's because if there's pressure and weight of the snowpack above, then it can compress and it can make it slightly more stable. In order for a grain to become weaker, it needs to grow, and it needs to grow into space. And so that's why we have at the moment this loose layer. It's not because it's that loose layer, of course, may provide a sliding surface, but what it does provide is space for grains to grow when the temperatures remain cold. But if you have a compact snowpack and it is very, very cold, then it's going to be very hard for weaknesses to develop. But potentially with the weight and the load, it can compress and it potentially become slightly more solid. But it may not eradicate completely the weakness.
So we have another, thank you, Mark. We have another question that's very specific to at the moment. So is it critical in all aspects or just east facing?
Well, again, in a moment, we'll actually look at the avalanche forecast, and we will be able to see. But the thing to note is the wind direction. And so again, when you're making judgments about where to go, so for instance, every day what we do before we go out on the hill, we look at the history of the wind shift through the night. So where the wind has been going from, where it's been swinging. So that will then give us a range of slopes and aspects where the snow has been deposited. And so that whole range is something that is really quite important. So it's very rare that it's just in one segment. It's usually 45 degrees or so to the main aspect. So if we had a westerly wind, it wouldn't just be on east, depositing on east, it would be on northeast and southeast aspects. We'd put them into the equation as well.
And I think this is a good one for our environments. So would it be as hazardous if the 4 centimeters of snow had not fallen? So if we were getting a buildup of wind slab over older hard snow?
Again, that's a very good question. But actually, what we have as well on that hard snow, we had hard snow, and then we had a clear night. And what tends to happen is we get crystals growing on the top of that. We had crystals growing on the top of that hard surface called a surface hoar. So not only do we have a weak soft layer, but we also have surface hoar growing. And surface hoar is a beautiful crystal, but it's incredibly it fails incredibly easily when it's overlain with new snow. But if we have the slab on top of the hard snow, it really depends on what temperature the temperatures are when the new snow arrives. So if we had hard snow and it was mild and wet and gradually got colder, then potentially it would knit. But because it's cold, then we get new snow, cold snow on that hard surface. It's less likely to bond, and it would still have instabilities. But right now, it's pretty. A lot of the avalanche incidents that we've had in the past have been this pattern. Okay, the pattern that we have right now, which is that what we described earlier. Hopefully that answers the question.
Yeah, it does. And it also answered the next question, which so we've asked it. A lot of the avalanche forecasts in the Alps this winter are mentioning buried hoarfrost layers. Is this often an issue in Scotland? So.
Again, a good question. The situation in the Alps is very, very much dependent on what happens at the beginning of the winter, what happens in December and January. And that if there's a shallow snowpack, we're talking shallow snowpack, maybe, less than a meter, 50 centimeters to a meter, then that will be affected by cold temperatures. And those cold temperatures will, if you like, turn that snowpack slowly into facets, or like sugar snow. And it's also called, this depth hoar is an extended version of it, and so on. And that's a really friable layer. We do get that, and but obviously not to the same extent, because we don't have as consistent a snowpack. But we do get facets and grains growing really, really fast. And one of the ingredients for facet development is a strong temperature gradient, but also its humidity, the vapor. And we have a damp climate, there's a lot of vapor. So the temperature drives the movement of vapor, and that builds up these crystals really, really fast. So we can get facet developing over in hours, I would say. Through the night, we can get facet grains developing, which with subsequent snowfall on top produces a weak layer. So we do have a really dynamic, fast changing environment. Mostly, I would say, in the Cairngorms, generally is about 2 degrees colder than further west. So in the Cairngorms, we do tend to get a lot more faceting than you might get in the west. But it's not to say it doesn't happen in the west also.
But facets, for anybody who doesn't know what a facet is, do you want to give a quick description?
Yeah. Okay. So basically, you'll have a snow crystal, and when it goes through a process of a good process, it loses its fingers and becomes round, and then each grain touches another grain and they begin to bond. Okay, and so that happens when you got a good temperature gradient. But if the temperature gradient is quite strong, then rather than being round, they become square. Don't ask me why they become square, but they become square and sugar-like and don't bond to one another. Okay, so that's as technical. Hopefully that describes the difference between facets. So it's square. It's square-faced. It's got faces. That's why it's called facets.
Okay, that's sugar snow that just won't stick.
Exactly. Yeah. Yeah.
A few more questions here. It's great. We're getting lots of questions. Are there any instances when you would get poor bonding between the snow and the ground surface itself?
Yeah, probably two scenarios. The first scenario in a cold environment, and again, if we go back to the Alps, when if it's cold and you got snow and you got vegetation at ground level, that again presents a lot of air and space, and so you'll get a lot of real strong facet developing at the ground level, and so in these cold climates, alpine, polar continental climates, center of Canada and so on, you will get faceting developing at ground level, and then you get full depth avalanches on faceted layers. Likewise, in the spring, you will get lubrication at ground level through water filtering on grass and rocks and so on of a certain angle, and then you get snow creep, and eventually it will fail. But quite a different scenarios. Obviously, the one buried surface hoar, buried depth hoar is a really bad one, and that's really what's causing a lot of the avalanche accidents right now in the Alps. This is buried depth hoar.
And the next question's a bit big picture, but interesting all the same. Do you see a trend in avalanche risk related to climate change? And can we expect more avalanches in the coming years?
Again, a really, really good question. I mean, I've been forecasting the Met Office and those and other organizations use time frames of 30 years, and that's a small sort of time frame. And so I've been involved, obviously, for many years, involved in avalanches, working with in avalanche terrain, etc. And I would say in these last 10 years that what has become most apparent is the rapidity of the rapid change of temperatures. From in the space of hours, it can change 12 degrees. So you can have -6 to +6 in a space of a few hours. And of course, that presents us with really startling differences. And this winter, not as much wind as previous winters. The last winter was really horrific for many days of over 100-mile-an-hour winds and massive shifts of temperature. This winter we have a much colder regime. We're in the jet stream pretty much is below us, and the jet stream, if you like, goes around the globe, and that is the boundary between a cold air mass in the Arctic and a warm air mass to the south of the jet stream. And so really we are in that cold air mass at the moment. So we're having a bit more of a stable situation, but it's good it's winter, good winter conditions, but it's bad because not many of us can actually get out there because of COVID. Hopefully that helps answer the question a little bit.
Yeah, no, it does. Thank you, Mark. So keep the questions coming in. We'll come back to some questions before we finish if anyone's got any more questions they want to put to Mark. And in the meantime, we'll use the time to explore some of this thinking by taking a look at a bit of a potential touring route and
Okay.
going through a decision-making process.
Great. Okay, so this is Lesley's wish trip. She's been trying it for many years, and there's a few options in here. So what we're going to do is show the trip, really. Lesley's going to explain a little bit about it. But what we're going to do is go through the process of saying, okay, maybe Lesley, this is what you're going to do tomorrow or the day after. And then we're going to say, okay, well, what do we do to, what do you need to look at to make sure that what we've got planned is going to work out?
Okay, thanks, Mark. So I'm sure, like many of you on here tonight, you're very excited to have snow cover fairly low down. So you can almost tour from the tree line up. And I'm sure you've all got routes that you've been planning over, 3, 4, 5, 10, 20 years that you've never been able to do because of one thing or another, whether that be avalanche danger or wind. That's always a good one, or visibility or snowpack. And the chances of all of those things coming together in Scotland are, as we know, slim. So when I was thinking about what route to really show Mark, I thought, well, why not go for how it is in Scotland? I'd like to go here and have a nosy. And having a nosy would mean also maybe, sorry, we've got a picture from Cora. We'll just show that to everyone.
Very nice.
Thanks, Cora.
Yeah.
So whilst planning a tour, but almost before looking at the snow forecast and the weather forecast, you've also got your optimum dream tour in your head, so that if when you look at the snow forecast and the weather forecast, it might be possible, then today would be the day, or tomorrow would be the day that you could do your dream tour. So that's the context behind unpacking the decision-making and planning process here. So we've got Glen Feshie. I'm sure some of you have been up there, maybe even recently, if you live locally. Conditions have been really lovely up there. And I've always been trying to go into Glen Feshie and then down into Glen Inich. Unfortunately, I've never found the conditions where it was safe or possible to do those things in the one day. So I've put together a couple of different options here. I've tried to keep to the options that are doable, so don't involve ropes and ice axes and abseiling over any cornices, which I would consider that's a very unique and different skill set. So I'm looking just to take my split board with harsh eisen and skins and all my normal touring safety gear, and go with, at the moment it would be one other buddy, but usually I might have 3 or 4 on a nice tour. So we've got the red route, which is the no holes barred, exciting run down to Loch Inich, starting in Athlean Car Park. And then I've got the green route, which is a more meandering route, longer route. It takes in a lot of nice scenery along the tops, overlooking Loch Inich, and comes down into Glen Inich, possibly finishing back at Coilen Bridge. 3 options there. And then I've got a likely more realistic route, bearing in mind that I've not looked at the forecast yet, so we might not have visibility, and it could be a blizzard. That would be a really nice tour up towards this route goes up the green route or up the red route and then back the blue line. So that would be not going into Loch Inich, which, to be fair, I've done many times in different versions, because I haven't been able to go down into Glen Inich for one reason or another. So yeah, over to you, Mark.
Okay, well, thanks a lot for your ambition. What I'll do is go now through the process, and really the process is, we've talked already before on the last webinar, and it's really, we have, in order to make a decision whether to go or not go, we need to then, we need to now think or look at these 3 different elements. And we need to look at those 3 different elements and consider them together. And so we're going to sort of go through that process in a little more detail. So primarily today, we're just going to look at the planning phase. We may identify on the map key places, and those key places are, areas where, we've got a decision whether we go left or right, or whether we carry on or don't carry on. And that's probably useful to identify that in your planning. But really, the planning stage is by far the most important stage. So I've got a few questions here, which I think is really walks you through the process of things that we need to consider. So the first thing is the history of the snowpack and what's gone on in the days leading up to tomorrow or the day after, when we're going to go on a tour. And so these are questions you will ask yourself. So for instance, Lesley, is there anything that you've noticed just in the past? Maybe you've looked at Avalanche Forecasts, or you've been out on the last days. Anything you've noticed?
Well, excuse me, I was out yesterday and I was in Glenfeshie, although just staying kind of a bit more lower level. And I definitely noticed the new snow, the few centimeters of new snow, loose new snow. And I'm pretty sure I also noticed some hoar frost crystals as well in places on that new snow, obviously on a hard base. The snow cover actually was fairly consistent, which was an unusual thing for Scotland. So usually you get at least one aspect that has nothing on it, really. But in general, above a certain height, the snow cover was good. So that also made me aware that you're not going to be able to spot maybe so easily, especially if it's low light, where the wind loading has occurred. There was no wind yesterday. It was very calm. There had been wind in the past. There was obviously some wind related features about, but they were definitely not new. They'd been there for at least a few days. And the avalanche conditions were, it was stable. So I looked at the avalanche forecast, and there wasn't a high risk of avalanche yesterday. So that was my observations.
Yeah, no, that's about right. So historically, up until today, or current situation, it was low hazard. It was unusually calm yesterday, and unusually we got a layer of a really nice carpet of new snow. So that historically is significant and relevant. But so then it's really what's happening now. And we'll look at the weather forecast and the avalanche forecast in a moment. But the thing that we need to know now, because things are developing and we need to think, okay, for tomorrow, what will the situation be? We need to look at what the avalanche forecast is, what the wind direction is, wind speed, temperature, freezing level. Is it snowing? And where is it in relation to aspects on this little rose here on the right? So let's just look at the resources that we've got, and I'll go through these. On the right is the Met Office, and this is a really good good facility or good resource, in that you can go to any of these little tags or a summit. And if you click on those tags, which it will do in a moment, it'll give you a really good readout of temperatures historically and into the future at those points. And this information is all derived from this supercomputer down in Exeter. And it's the supercomputer in Exeter that produces our weather forecasts, which go to the forecast team in Aberdeen, the Met Office team in Aberdeen, who then pass them on to us. So we have, and the forecasts are really, really accurate that we find. And so it's the same data goes into the summits here. So that's a very, very good resource. But let's just look first of all at the Avalanche Forecast. Let me just see. Can you see that okay, Lesley?
Yeah, we can see that.
Okay, so here we have the our avalanche forecast. And so what we need to do first of all is we can get historic information. And so if we look at the top, the diamond at the top, we got 21 going back in time. And you can see on the 19th, just a few days ago, and that was when Lesley was skiing in that soft snow layer, that was a low hazard, but now it's increased. Today, it was considerable, and tomorrow it's considerable. And you can see that as I scroll up here, accumulation of poorly bonded wind slab will continue to develop tonight and through the day, through tomorrow, on east to south aspects above 600 meters. That's quite a low altitude. Localized poorly bonded wind slab will also be present on northeast and southwest aspects due to cross loading. And that means that the wind has been blowing sort of northwesterly and or will be blowing sort of northwesterly, and it'll be largely depositing on the east to south aspects, but also it'll be blowing alongside valleys and along slopes and depositing behind features and stuff. So that's what the cross loading is, and that will go going right down to at least 400 meters and maybe a bit lower. So above 400 meters, it's still unstable, but it's more localized. But nonetheless, it's quite a significant situation we have at the moment. So we need to note those aspects right the way from northeast, east, southeast, south, and southwest. Above 400 meters, there's unstable snow in isolated places up to 600 meters. Then above 600 meters, it's slightly more widespread. Okay, so that's the situation at the moment. We also can look at the weekly snowpack summary, and again that describes the situation that we had, and in that snowpack summary, that really does often talk about weaknesses that we've identified in the past and see if they still are persisting. And so really it talks about today that Storm Christoph, with significant snowfall, very strong northwest winds, has developed deep wind slab accumulation on many lee aspects to low levels. And the fact that that wind slab overlies a weak soft layer containing buried surface ore and new snow that fails readily underfoot. So it's not a great story so far in terms of us doing your route at the moment, Lesley. So that is, we have an avalanche hazard of considerable, but then the most other thing that we need to look at are these icons down at the bottom. And these are the key problems that lead us to produce the avalanche hazard level, which is considerable. So the bottom one on the left is that windsock, which is wind slab, significant wind slab, an accumulation rate greater than 3 centimeters per hour, whether it's snowfall or wind blown, is a critical loading. And so we have with wind, I mean, it can be or a couple of meters in an hour. So in Scotland, so it's really quite significant. And then we have the one in the middle, a symbol in the middle, which is a persistent weak layer, and then we have that weak layer, and that will persist potentially with these cold temperatures. And then we have the other icon, which is the cornice collapse. Cornices are building as well on those aspects. So those key, the color, the spread of the avalanche hazard, and those icons are really key for us in terms of identifying where the hazard is. So let's go back. On one other thing, of course, is the observed avalanche hazard. And we've got 5 avalanches in the last 7 days. and you can look at those, or corners triggered. That was when it was warm a few days ago. And again, it tells you what happened actually today. So here, this is absolutely good information. The forecast is we've taken our observed snowpack observations, and we've incorporated what's gone on with the weather and the snow, and that generally is pretty good, but you've got to be careful sometimes with the forecast. Yeah. So here we have the wind's going to be pretty much northwest and coming westerly. We have reasonably bright in the day. So not bad, but it's still going to be windy. So overnight is pretty much the key things for us. So that's why we still have a considerable hazards, but that weak layer will persist. So we've done the weather and the avalanche. The other thing then, Lesley, is to now talk about how well prepared you are. All right. And so these are human factor things. So is the equipment you'll be using appropriate for a planned trip? You know, it's been icy. It's quite high up. Is all your equipment familiar and functioning? Have you tested it and used it?
It's January. We've been out a few times. In looking at the forecast, we would be having a conversation around maybe we shouldn't be going anywhere too steep because it's going to be very icy underneath, and we would likely not cope on just the harsh sizing. So we do we can use crampons and ice axes, but that's not the intention on this tour. So we're starting to think red loop is definitely out, possibly also green loop, and then on to considering now the weather forecast and the avalanche conditions.
Okay.
So those will have to be put aside for another day.
Okay, and skills and experience, it's really important. Is the planned activity suitable for everybody or group members? The weather and the ground suitable for all members, and does everyone have the appropriate skill level for what you're going to do? And probably these are like really important things, aren't they? Because you've got to engage everybody, because the worst thing you can be in is a situation where you don't feel comfortable and you're being dragged along doing something you're not really happy with.
And that's a really important consideration for this tour that we have in mind, where the two people going would be about the same level and comfortable to go for a good 4 or 5 hours in the day up and down. So I think we're good. Everyone's got the right gear and is fit and healthy currently.
Okay. And then the other one is communication. And again, this is some strange questions in here, which some of us may not be comfortable with. And there's what has heuristic traps. What the heck are they? A lot of people may be familiar with them, but really it's in terms of when people set objectives, when you're committed to do something, it's a very, very powerful driver. And that comes back to this formula that we talked about with the Avalanche Aware formula. If you have one of the elements, which is your commitment, that will overshadow and overweigh all those other elements and might influence you negatively in terms of your decision making. So commitment, scarcity, you talked about, Lesley, in that the conditions that you get in Scotland are rare often, and you've got to seek the opportunity, and there's nothing wrong with that. I think you just have to be aware of the possible effect it can have on decision making, because it's really good, isn't it, to have an objective and to want to do something, but you've just got to sort of have a frame of mind, I think, in Scotland, whereby you've got to say, actually, not this year either. It might be next year. I don't know what your thoughts are on that.
Absolutely. It's patience is definitely a virtue.
Yeah.
Temperance.
And then finally in this one, is there a leader and are there group roles? Now, this is a bit of a weird one because this comes from statistics actually and from data in that looking at accidents and incidents, and mostly incidents occur when there is no leader or there is no roles within a group and people are sort of randomly doing things, and it's just maybe if I go in the mountains with a bunch of mountain guides, they're the worst group to go with because no one makes any decision. We're sort of going around randomly, but it is proven that it's good to actually have a leader, and maybe something you could formally do, or someone maybe takes over the navigation a bit and they're used as the leader for that bit because that's where they're skilled. So I don't know what your thoughts are on that, Leslie.
Yeah, I feel very uncomfortable if I'm in a group and, like you say, there's no either clearly identified person leading, even if the hierarchy is fairly flat, and people are, just kind of doing their own random things, because the communication tends to get worse and worse and not better and better. And sometimes a leader will come out, just naturally within the group, and I tend to ask the question, who's going to lead, who's going to make the key decisions if that doesn't happen naturally. And people are genuinely relieved when you have that conversation. And often if I'm touring with people who are less experienced, they are expecting me to be the leader. But if I feel that expectation and I don't want to be the leader, it's my responsibility to say that.
Yeah.
And it's also my responsibility to say where my boundaries are. If I'm expected to be the leader, what my personal boundaries are and what my professional boundaries are, to keep everybody safe, including myself. So I think it's really important to be confident enough to speak up. Where we often have miscommunication, and we talked a bit about this with Andy in his talk. If I go with my partner, and we obviously know each other really well, it's more into the heuristic traps. And I told a story at the start of the season. We went touring and we had to cross a river, and we decided to try, Ewan decided to try, I don't want to chop you in it, to cross the river with bin bags over our feet. And from the minute we were talking about it, I didn't like the idea. And I thought the idea was a silly idea. But I went along with it instead of going, I think that's a silly idea, I don't really want to do it. And inevitably, it wasn't dangerous. The river wasn't deep and we weren't that far away from anything. And getting wet feet was just annoying and a bit uncomfortable rather than being dangerous in that circumstance. But if you are worried about something and you let yourself be talked into it, quite often the worst case scenario happens. It's almost, you're expecting it to go wrong, so it does. So one bin bag fell down and leaked, and I got soaking wet foot, and it kind of ruined the day. I should have just said, no, I don't want to cross the river with bin bags. So that's a good example of how you can be. And I wasn't coerced into doing that at all. We just didn't talk about it. I just went along with it. It was completely on me. It's a heuristic trap because I wasn't prepared to state what I was comfortable with. So yeah, I think that it's an important discussion to have.
Yeah, open. Everyone should have the opportunity to voice their opinion, and that is a key thing. Communication is one of the key aspects of avoiding not just avalanche incidents, but other incidents that could lead you into sort of difficulty. And so then next we have the landscape. So we have the weather and avalanche. We've looked at the human factor side of things with the equipment, and finally it's the landscape that we're going to go into. And so identify your proposed route on the map, which we're going to look at that again in a minute. What aspects of the slope you may encounter on your journey, what angles of the slope will you encounter. And there are some really good tools you can get, which little cards. This is a Be Avalanche Aware one, but you can also get one, I think it's Shaven Raspberry or something. But they have really good little measuring devices which you can put on the map, which you can then work out what the actual angle is. And so generally speaking, well, today, for instance, it was releasing on 20 degrees, actually. But normally, you want to look at slopes of ascent of about 15 degrees. That's a nice, comfortable angle. So if you can sort of stick to that sort of thing, then that's good, or even or less. And then you're identifying shapes of slopes. And why you're looking at shapes of slopes is because they're quite critical in terms of, let's say, if there's instability, then a convex slope is more tricky, because it, when you descend the slope, it gradually gets steeper and steeper. And so basically the slope is under tension. And so if there's a weakness and you go on a convex slope, then you're more likely to trigger something than you would if you were on a uniform slope or a concave slope. So slope shape is a really good thing to look out for when you're skiing and descending. So naturally, you should always aim to not ski over a convexity. So when you're standing on a slope, you should see the whole slope, and that then usually is an indicator that it's a uniform slope. So we can look at that on the map. And so we have these routes here. We had the wind primarily is sort of northwesterly. So we have, I think, in the red route, the green route, and the blue route going from Acklane up actually are on a slope that's sort of southeasterly or southwesterly rather. And that was one of the slopes that was indicated in the avalanche report as being hazardous. All right. So that will be those slopes there. I wouldn't want to go on those. The green area, I think, is going to be better because that's going to be on a more of a windward slope. In terms of angles, then the red route cuts that slope just below a spot height there, 783, and that slope at its steepest is just under 30 degrees. I measured it actually because I was on it the other week, and I actually had used the Be Avalanche Aware app, and it was just under 30 degrees in that steep areas. So that's quite a steep angle, and that will have snow accumulation. So I'd probably want to stay away from that. And to me, going up the green, up that ridge is a safe direction, safe slope, windward facing, and it is a good shape. It looks fairly uniform. The slope below 783, although it's steep, it is a uniform shape, actually. It's not convex. So the route, actually, the green, is a pretty good line, I would say, at the moment. If you look again at the blue, that as it swings north and cuts across and goes up to Milavui, then again, that is a slope that would be loaded, I would say, from northwesterlies. So those slopes there are pretty, I wouldn't want to go on those. So that's the sort of situation, I think, by looking at the slope shape and angle and aspect. Would you sort of agree with that, Lesley?
Yeah, I would definitely agree with it. After looking at the avalanche forecast, I'm definitely thinking, might be time to reassess.
Yeah. And so the next is really, we're looking at avalanche terrain. So what's a start zone? Avalanche paths. And there's a question there, how often will you be exposed to avalanche terrain? And there's questions there like occasionally, frequently, or continually. And we need to consider the probability of any avalanche release, whether it, we could be going in a nice, have chosen a nice route that is fine, but somebody else might be above us to create something. And we need to look at how vulnerable we may be. So again, we look at the terrain and we're looking at, are there any terrain traps, gullies, or anything that we could be affected by? So I know this all sounds a bit of a grim subject, but it's things that really, to be wise and to be fully aware of the terrain you're going into, it is worth considering these things. So we're looking at start zones, avalanche exposure, and we're looking at what happens if potential consequences also in that terrain. So a reminder of start zones, largely 25 to 30 degrees, but the optimum angle is 37. So I think, there are lots of angles there in all those routes that approach are on those sorts of slopes. Avalanche paths, you can have multiple start zones feed into an avalanche path, and you've got obviously a deposition run out zone. But I think the key thing for us is to work out, okay, if we're going into avalanche terrain and we're exposed, how often and how frequently are we exposed? So if we're only doing it occasionally, then, you can sort of be mindful, you identify what slopes might be hazardous, and you can sort of go across one by one. You've got many options to change your mind or change your route. Likewise, frequent, if terrain becomes a bit more challenging, a few less options. But the key one not to get involved in, especially when there's avalanche hazard, is where you're continually exposed to avalanche hazard. So you've got multiple start zones around you that if anything happens, it could feed in. So let's say you're in a gully or something, or a narrow valley, going up the middle of a narrow valley, that would be a really bad place to travel because you're continually exposed. And so I think if we look at the map, then we might see some of those places where we probably don't want to be. So if you look at the map here and you look at Acklane and you've got the green, the blue and the red route, I think going up the slope on the green, I think you go down near the burn. You see, you enter the burn. Now that is a really, you would be in quite an exposed place there to avalanche hazard. So if anyone else was milling around or skiing and the avalanche hazard was significant, any release would affect you if you're around the burn line on that green route. So that would be a place that I would be really a bit nervous about. And I'd be really careful about exposing myself at that location with a certain level of avalanche hazard. So it may be that rather than going into the burn on that northern side of the burn, I may come way south of that burn on that much more mellow angles. So and so that would be something that I would have in my mind there. Once we get up onto the ridge, it's a pretty good terrain. The other routes, though, like the blue route, we are traveling in quite a few into areas where we would be more exposed from other activity, especially when we go at the base of Corryrua there. Again, we've got multiple start zones above us, and they could feed down into that burn, and so on. That makes sense, Lesley?
Yeah, that makes really good sense, Mark. Thank you very much. Let's see if we have any questions. So we've got a few questions in the chat. So thank you very much for sharing your knowledge, Mark. Can I ask for your top tip on which piece of kit you would class as essential for a mountain bike leader to carry in these conditions, already carrying a multitude of weather-specific kits?
So I presume it's a mountain biker who's going to go up into the hills. Is that right?
I'm guessing yes.
Yeah. Well, I must say I've been seeing quite a few around, so it's good. I think mountain biking in steep terrain is not too dissimilar, actually, to sort of skiing and boarding and traveling, in that similar sort of risk factors. For me, though, the clothing that for winter that I can't function without is in bad weather when you can't see. So having really good goggles is important. And I think I said, as last week, a really good jacket with a good cowl, and the other are gloves, because if you can't see and you lose your ability to manipulate with your hands, then I guess that really inhibits what you can do.
The tool for measuring the slope angles from the map, what was that?
If you can go on to, it's a website called Shaven Raspberry.
That's all. Somebody's put the link in the chat.
Yeah,
of the
that's
question.
right. There's a really good like credit card size thing. We have some that we've produced as well, both for 10-meter contour maps and 15 contour maps. They're the Harvey maps and the Ordnance Survey maps. But because we're in lockdown, we haven't really managed to distribute them. But they're also good as well. But you can get the Shaven Raspberry ones easily by buying them on the internet.
Here's a good people one. Heuristic trap, a new term, but that's made the issue crystal clear from past experiences. Do you have any tips on sorting out conflict in such situations?
Wow.
What do you do when you're out with the mountain guides and you'll want to do something different?
Well, generally it's because we've randomly just gone off like in some sort of tribal movement up the mountain, and we haven't really got our act together. But then suddenly, I think people are confident enough to talk about their weaknesses, or talk about weaknesses which might be, I don't like this, I feel really uncomfortable. And this uncomfortableness, this sixth sense, is actually often referred to as expert intuition. And so and so therefore I think it's really good to be alert to that. And so many times, so many incidents I've heard, and people have come to me and they said, I knew it was going to avalanche, or I knew X was going to happen. I've heard that so many times, and it's probably because they don't feel able to be open about it. And then I've heard about other people who've said, they've eventually said, I don't like this. And then suddenly everyone else says, I don't like it either. And so actually, I think you've got to be, people feel that, you can't say something to demonstrate this weakness, or you're not enjoying it. But I think you've got to actually be brave enough to just say, I'm not enjoying this. I don't like it. Something's not right. And if it's not right, then there's probably good reason for it. And if that is the situation, you're in the wrong place.
Certainly one tip is if you state yourself something that you're not comfortable with, even if it's you had to make your sandwiches with peanut butter because there was no cheese in the fridge this morning, that breaks the ice, and people will be more likely to tell the group how they really feel about things. So be prepared to share your vulnerability to benefit everybody's ability to feel safe enough to speak up.
Yeah, but it is tricky. But I think hopefully Well, when I go in the mountains, I'm really careful who I go with. I only really go with people I know and trust. And you know, when I'm going to do something sort of significant and to share it with somebody, um, I'm very rarely will go to in the mountains with someone I don't really know very well, because sometimes, you know, it's really important to be open and share your weaknesses or your fears.
Um,
Okay.
we are running a little bit over, but we'll try and wrap it up in the next few questions. I'm going to roll a few questions into one here. There's a few questions about the green route coming back down. So what's your thinking on the green route? Estimated angle maybe 21 degrees and downwind, and somebody else saying in previous avalanche training they'd been encouraged to consider slope angles of less than 30 as relatively safe when the avalanche forecast is considerable. Is that too simplistic? And if the burn is on the green run is in a zone that's a little or not as big a hazard, is it as much of a consideration?
Okay, a few questions there. The 30-degree slope, well, that depends. And again, there's no rules. I think it's very, right now, we have a weak layer that is failing on 25 degrees. Also, and I think if it develops and stays cold, I think it'll be more fragile and be even releasing at lower angles. That's quite unusual, but you can't have a rule like that. Like you know, it's generally okay below 30 degrees because it depends. So you know, you've got to be open-minded to things that might be different. The green route, again, you know, the angle is fairly mellow, I would say. Going up the ridge of Corrigorm, it would be in the region of around, that would be in the region of around 15 degrees, I think. But I don't obviously have to measure it accurately with the map. So that would be quite good. And I can't remember what the other question was. But one of the final things that we need to identify here is the key places where we make decisions. Okay. So I think for me, in terms of route choice, when we're coming up from Acklane, we get to the trees, and that's when we emerge and we see the slopes ahead of us. And so that would be a key place for me there in terms of determining what route I go up. I could see the loading, but of course the caveat, the most important thing is you've got to be able to see. If you can't see and it's got poor visibility, you're completely stuck. And that in terms of making good decisions in terrain. If you can't see, you can't make good decisions. So you're therefore going to have to really use the map carefully, navigate really carefully to avoid any straying onto steeper slopes. So the first key place is above the forest, and then probably I would probably make a decision of going up the green route, but maybe not heading into the burn, going out left. So that would be a key place. Higher up, you know, if you're going on the red route or the blue route and it's sort of more moderate terrain, then the red route, for instance, you've got obviously a number of key places. When you're top of Comban Moor, you can see, you then decide as to whether you're going to go down, and you get to above the steepening, and that's another key place as well, whether you're going to descend down to the loch or not. Again, you really need to see. You might descend to the loch, and then you might say, I don't actually fancy going back up. What am I going to do then? So you maybe go out via Loch and Elan. So and those key places are really important in terms of both decision making and route choice, but also really important in terms of whether you're going to go down a slope or not in terms of the avalanche hazard. And really what you're doing by the time you get to those key places, you've had all that preparation, you've had all the looking at all the resources to prep you for the day. But on the day and on your travels, you're actually looking at all those observations all the time and feeling what's underneath your feet and reacting to what's underneath your feet.
So I think we can start to wrap it up. So a question about can this information be applied to other areas in Scotland? So for example, can we assess the risk in the Pentlands tomorrow?
Yes, I would say. In fact, if you go to oh no, who was it? I saw an image today on Facebook of an avalanche in the Pentlands, full depth avalanche that has gone on this same weak layer that's here. So yes, you can apply those same principles, I would say. So Lesley, this is the final question here. What's your decision? So we looked at the avalanche hazard, the abilities of everybody in the landscape. What are you thinking?
So I'm thinking I'll get the map back out. I may go up that green route and come back, probably back down the green route. My first concern is the visibility, like you said, and I'm glad you brought that up because especially in Glenfeshie, the landscape is quite featureless. And if you don't have good viz, it's not fun actually to go up into the mist there. And I find that, there's not much point. Obviously it's good if you want to practice your navigation. I might do that if it's stay low and practice navigation if it's not too good on the visibility side. So it's basically reassess time, Mark.
I think so. We'll see what tomorrow brings, but it's pretty marginal, and it's pretty today when we were out forecasting, it felt it's a pretty serious conditions at the moment. So I would hold back a bit, I think. But it's been a bit of a rush, I think, going through. But hopefully it's given people an idea of the process. And of course, this webinar will be recorded so people can have, look at it in the leisure and go through these stages and look at the various questions, which hopefully will help for future planning.